According to a new EPA report, fracking does not actually pose a significant risk or danger to our drinking water. They say we have some additional details as well.
I think you've already misspoken.
Finally, some hard stats.
What is that?
The word is not, you don't want to say, they didn't say that it doesn't prove a risk. They said.
No, I said massive risk. It doesn't, that's exactly what they said.
Oh,
it does not pose
I
a
thought what they had
massive
said
risk.
was, nothing horrible has yet happened.
Yeah. No. We're going to get to all those stipulations, both from the EPA and from others, ecologists looking on the report. But I do want to give you the initial details. The analysis, which drew on peer-reviewed studies as well as state and federal databases, found that activities associated with fracking do have the potential to impact drinking water resources, but it concluded that these impacts have been few and far between. The report did identify several possible areas of concern, including water withdrawals in times of or in areas near low water availability, spills of hydraulic fracturing fluids and produced water, fracturing directly into underground drinking water resources, which does sound bad, below ground migration of liquids and gases, and inadequate treatment and discharge of water, but they did not find evidence that these mechanisms have led to widespread systemic impacts on drinking water resources. Although importantly, you should bear in mind that although it took 5 years for them to put together this report, they said repeatedly in the years leading up to today that they wanted to do what are called prospective water studies, where they had samples before fracking in an area and 1 and 2 years after fracking in an area. But unfortunately, to do that, they needed the cooperation of the companies doing the fracking. Those companies declined to provide that cooperation, and so the report, even from the EPA's point of view, is inherently flawed because they don't have the sort of water samples that you need to definitively say if it has an impact. And they don't have that because of the companies doing the fracking.
So it's not a good sign when you don't cooperate. Like, isn't that what the Republicans always say? If you got nothing to hide, why don't you just tell the government, what you're up to, or let them look at your metadata or whatever it might be. So if you got nothing to hide, fracking companies, why are you keeping all the data from the government, right?
Yeah.
All of a sudden, they're not big fans of that argument. But in this case, there is some element of truth to it, right? So if the government came in, barged in here and were like, okay, young Turks, we think you're secretly doing whatever, right? Shooting porn in here, right? Like, have at it, Huss. Look around, right? We're not doing anything wrong here, right? So I don't want you to spy on me illegally or anything like that, but if you accuse me with some sort of weird charge, right, that I'm clearly not doing, I'm like, okay, sure, here. We're not doing it, right? So now, having said that, I'm really torn by this story. So I don't know which way to go here. I don't know if I trust the EPA or not.
Oh, okay.
So, no,
no, how can you, first of all, what the title of their study should have been was oil and gas companies make it impossible for us to do a scientific study about fracking. That should be the head of this. How they could even come to a conclusion, like Johnny said, how could they even come to a conclusion? They weren't allowed to test the water before and after. What are they doing?
But I think we've got it slightly wrong because really, again, here's the story in Forbes, which is saying, look, the title of their headline is EPA fracking study, drilling wins. Okay? So that their opinion.
Oh, it's in Forbes.
It's in Forbes. It's pretty clearly where it's
No, but all the time we hear no, you can't put the opinion in the stories. Unless the industry is one, in which case you can put the opinion in the headline.
Well, in the tiniest writing in the world at the top, it says opinion. Right? And I mean, it is tiny. But finally, the environmental EPA has admitted what the oil and gas industry has been saying for more than 60 years, quote, hydraulic fracturing activities have not led to widespread systemic impacts to drinking water sources. So this story doesn't really talk about risk. It really doesn't, this study. This study said nothing horrific has happened.
Well, that does factor into future risk.
I got it, but they don't talk because but the point is that I think it's significant because they do then say here are some of the things that could happen, and this guy in fact points out that fracking opponents will latch on to the things that could happen and to what Jimmy said, which is that the industry was not cooperative in the study. So, but the fact of the matter is why I think Cenk is torn and why I'm torn is that the facts are there hasn't been anything that's really gone wrong, and that is a fact. That seems true.
So
and there aren't. But there aren't a bunch of people who were quieted down who would now be screaming, saying, "No, it massively distorted this, and we weren't allowed in the report." Maybe there will be, but the study of, if you think that eventually this house is going to collapse at the next earthquake, and you go, there's been 2 earthquakes and the house is still standing, you're correct. The House is still standing, and that's essentially what this report said.
Yeah.
So in the old days, if the EPA said, "Hey, you know what? We checked this out, and it turns out it's fine. You know, it's got potential risks, but so far it has not leaked into the water in a way that is significant and causes huge issues," I would have trusted them. Now I'm a little skittish. I think there's so much influence of corporate America in government, revolving door, all that stuff, that I think like, well, here's another instance of the government saying, "No, don't worry, what the corporations are doing are great." But it is the EPA, and obviously
They're relatively insulated compared to other agencies.
they are a little bit, and the fracking companies certainly don't like them. So it's not like, you see what I'm saying? That gives more credibility to what the EPA did. And so I do feel like, okay, well, that's an interesting data point. And look, guys, we've got to get energy somewhere, right? Do I prefer that it's the sun and the wind and it's more renewable, et cetera? Absolutely, right? Do I prefer that it's not coal, which is worse than the other forms of fossil fuels, et cetera? Yes. Norway today, by the way, divested from coal, which is a really interesting thing for a nation to do. But fracking, I don't know. I'm open on it.
But we also have to bear in mind, though, the risks, or not the risks, the damage done already can be few and far between, and that means if they're not doing it here, which technically I believe they are actually doing fracking nearby, then it doesn't affect us. But the people in the communities that they do it in have been affected by it. And even then, look, the risk to the groundwater, that is one of the concerns that we've had over fracking. It is not the only concern. I would say it's not the largest concern. We saw that stat showing in Oklahoma that almost immediately after fracking began, the number of earthquakes just skyrocketed and has stayed consistently high in the years ever since. So if it's destroying the state, then yeah, it's good that it isn't also wrecking the water necessarily, but that is not the only reason to potentially be against it.
No, I'm more
too.
concerned about the earthquakes. I mean, yeah, the Oklahoma study is amazing, right? And so there seems to be a very clear link about the earthquakes. The degree to which the earthquakes are damaging, they're smaller generally, et cetera. That's an open question. I'd want to study it more in different states. And yes, it appears that we are, I know it's a reference I make often, even though I don't really particularly care that much about Lord of the Rings, but we're drilling just like the dwarves in Lord of the Rings, deeper and deeper into the earth, until one day we're going to release the Balrog in our infinite greed, and here we are, the earthquakes, and maybe it gets in the water, et cetera. So I take all that, but if I'm president, I'm not really worried about the Balrog. I got to make a decision on what is the best, the worst, somewhere in the middle of different energy sources and what we have to do here. And I might prefer this to Arctic drilling, to coal, certainly to the XL Keystone pipeline that's going to bring in the worst of the fossil fuels. So that's why I'm still split on it.